You're listening to the St John's Diamond Creek podcast. This episode presented by Associate Minister Joel Snibson.
Today's reading is from Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 20. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. But the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? Nor can the gift of God be compared with the result of one man's sin. The judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation, but the gift followed many trespasses and brought justification. For if by the trespass of the one man death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and of the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man the many will be made righteous. The law was brought in so that the trespass might increase, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, in this moment, current world events are demonstrating how much leadership a nation's representative matters. We have seen how the actions of one nation's representative, a president, can have massive domino effects for the daily lives of its people, their economy, but also having consequential impacts for the people from other nations, even countries worldwide. President Vladimir Putin's unilateral decision to invade Ukraine and ongoing war now for 3 years has had a massive impact on every person in Russia, living through the realities of war, sanctions, loss of friends and family of those conscripted. And of course, this one man's action has impacted the people of Ukraine, a nation consisting of individual stories of trauma and grief, with many lives cut short from this relentless war. The decision of one man has significant impacts on many. Representation matters. Well, today we're continuing our series in Romans 5 to 8 called The Power of the Gospel. And last week in Romans 5 verses 1 to 11, we saw that justification, which means being made right with God in Jesus, brings us peace with God, hope in suffering, assurance of God's love. Yet as Christians living our lives, often we're confronted with our sin, and it can be hard to believe that this is true for us, that we're justified by grace alone. And how can justification be applied to us, those living over 2,000 years after Jesus? Well, our passage in Romans 5 verses 12 to 21, we'll see that our justification is only possible because of our representation. That more than anything, our representation matters. Please follow along in your Bibles today, where we see our first point: we all have a representative. In verse 12, we see Adam is automatically everyone's representative. We meet the one man, the first human, Adam, and you can read about him in Genesis 2 and 3, where God generously invited the first humans to eat from any tree in the garden. There was only one tree they must not eat from, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what did they do? They ate from the tree. They tragically rejected God. And as promised, the consequences were immediate with a terrible chain reaction in verse 12. Sin entered the world through Adam. Death entered the world as a penalty of sin. And death becomes universal because of sin. Because of Adam's disobedience, sin and death entered the world. And it meant that every human now faced two types of death. Adam spiritually died and it was expelled from God's loving presence. And he, like every human being since, would also physically die. The sting of death, our mortality, was something once alien and unnatural, and it became the new normal. And even more consequential was the spiritual death, being cut off from a good and loving God. This is utter devastation. Adam terribly stuffed up, and humanity is in a terrible predicament. But how is Adam automatically our representative? What's this primitive man got to do with us? Well, the because is in verse 12, because all sinned. And this is one of those times where the original language is actually important. It indicates a single past action. So the whole human race sinned in one past action. He's not saying that all humans die because we often sin like Adam or followed his bad example, while this is all true, but because we were all in Adam. We were with Adam. So in this moment, when Adam sinned, we also sinned. Well, this sounds all very strange because clearly we were not alive back then when the world population was just 2. How are we implicated and responsible for the first man's sin thousands of years ago? Well, to understand how Adam is automatically everyone's representative, we first need to challenge our worldview. The idea of us sinning with Adam sounds strange because we are mostly shaped by Western individualism. From school, we're taught, I'm responsible for my actions and you are responsible for your actions. We believe people thrive or fail based on their own decisions and actions. So we consider humanity in terms of individual people. Yet the Bible takes a radically different approach of collective responsibility and solidarity in relationship with others, where other people's wins and losses also become ours. If you've grown up in an Eastern culture, you'll better understand this solidarity. Just think, every single Australian, no matter who they are, where they live, has a representative, an MP, who physically goes to Parliament in Canberra to be our voice. Maybe you play a team sport where the individual is not the focus but being part of the team. Footy's back. Just picture, your forward marks the ball 50 metres out after the siren and you're 5 points down. The whole team's success and joy entirely rides on one person's ability to kick straight on everyone's behalf. They represent us in their action for good or for bad. If the player nails the kick and wins the game, we all celebrate saying, we won, as if we kicked it. But if he misses, fickle supporters can blame the forward, saying, even I would have been able to kick that. So often we claim our representatives' victories and we blame their failures. Look, a Russian citizen can't really say that I'm not personally at war with Ukraine. No matter how they feel, they are. Because their representative declared war, the whole nation has declared war. And we expect our representative to act for us. But often, we grate against someone representing us. We say, it's not fair that I should be judged for what someone else has done. We argue, we didn't choose Adam. I didn't vote for him to represent us. If I was going to give someone this power, I want someone who would authentically represent my views and not stuff it up. But could you choose a better stand-in for us than God, the one who created both Adam and us? In Adam, God created the most accurate, fair representative for each of us. So we can't blame Adam like a fickle footy crowd thinking that we would do better, because 100% guaranteed every one of you would have eaten the fruit. I would have eaten too. We all joined him in that horrific sin. But if what's true for our representative Adam is also true for us, this means our guilt for sin before God. In verse 13, now the law has been given, and because every single human dies, it's evidence that sin has been charged to each of our accounts, and we are all guilty before God, our judge. Secondly, our sinful nature. Back in Romans 3 verses 9 to 20, we considered how sin enslaves us, reaching every part of us. Sure, humans have great potential for doing good, but sadly, sin is now more powerful and invades every part of us, our will, our emotions, our intellect. And thirdly, we've seen our sinful choice. We've seen how we've all sinned with Adam. And the way that Adam's sin is now ours is described as our original sin and has been passed down to every human throughout every generation from birth. As a parent of young children, I'm amazed how they reflect ourselves back to us. Like a sponge, they pick up everything, the good things, the bad things. The other day, Naomi, my 2-year-old, was way too quiet for too long, so I went to her room and I found her and asked, Mimi, did you eat the chocolate from the table? She directly looked in my eyes with a cute smile and said, No, Daddy. Meanwhile, her hands and her face was all covered in chocolate. She heard my footsteps coming and her little hands hid the remaining evidence of chocolate. See, lying is one thing I didn't have to model or teach her. She's already a professional. She's already naturally gifted at doing the wrong thing and covering it up. While it's cute, there is a devastating spiritual reality behind how she innately and skillfully and perfectly retraces Adam's rebellion in the garden to a T. Every day, we see the reality of us being in Adam. Just reflect on our world. People have so much potential for love and self-sacrifice, yet the good always seems to be overwhelmed by selfishness and injustice and war and misery and fear, and sin and death lurks, overshadowing us. Just consider our relationships. They can be so life-giving, the joy of friendship, to be truly known, to laugh, to share support in the tough times. Yet so easily relationships are fractured by conflict, mistrust. People disappoint and hurt us. Sin and death lurk, overshadowing what's good. So facing the predicament of sin and death, we can think we just need better influences around or more education. I just need to teach my daughter not to steal chocolate. We see that we just need to enforce everyone to follow the rules. We've seen this argument with current wars where we just need everyone to respect international law, but it doesn't work. Putin won't stop the war through more education about international law or having better people around him. If we all really share Adam's guilt, his sinful nature and choice, the problem goes too deep to be fixed by more effort or education. Look to verse 20. The law has brought in so that the trespass might increase. Even God's moral code can't deal with our sin. In fact, the law makes things worse, exposing our guilt more clearly. Friends, being represented by Adam is bad news that we're more sinful than we believe. We're completely powerless to do anything about it ourselves. This is confronting. This is hard to hear. Feel the despairing predicament of our sin and death under Adam. But there's hope. Verse 14. Adam is a pattern of the one to come. Leads me to my second point. Jesus is our superior representative. While every human automatically has Adam as their representative, there's another possible representative on offer. And in verses 18 and 19, Adam and Christ are compared, and see the table on the screen. Paul uses different categories showing with Adam and Jesus that their one act determines the outcome for the many people they represent. In both cases, what they've done is transferred, for better or for worse, to those they represent. Clearly, Adam's representation has been disastrous. But just think, if we had to represent ourselves before God's throne, we're charged guilty, so we would also have no defense. But what if a perfect second Adam came to be our representative? Despite all our objections, God dealing with us through a representative would be good news. See verse 19. For just as through the disobedience of one man, many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of one man, many will be made righteous. Friends, while we can't become right with God through rule following and effort and morality, but only through Jesus becoming our representative instead of Adam. Look, Jesus was the only human who perfectly obeyed God, and ultimately this was shown on the cross, where Jesus in our place, in his one great act, grace overcame sin and life overcame death. And through Jesus representing us, even though while we are undeserving, it means what's true for Jesus now becomes true for us. He took on himself the penalty of our disobedience, but also gifted us with his perfect obedience. He made us right with God, and we're no longer guilty in Adam. But how what Jesus did over 2,000 years ago justify us today? Well, justification becomes real in our lives when we are united to Christ. And Romans 6 says more on this. Switching our representation from being in Adam to being in Jesus. Jesus' representation isn't passed on from birth or from our parents or from having Christian values or being a good, upstanding person in the community, but by putting our faith and trust in Jesus. If you're here today and you've experienced that life in Adam doesn't work, if the impacts of sin and death have overshadowed your joy and harmed your relationships, has led to fear, put your hope in Jesus. Today, he has outstretched hands saying, I've got you. I'll represent you. Just come as you are. The gift is free. I offer you new life. In Jesus, grace is more wonderful and powerful than sin. And while both Adam and Jesus operate as representatives, Paul clarifies in verse 15, but the gift is not like the trespass. And in verses 15 to 17, he shows how Christ's work is superior to Adam's in every way. The contrast could not be more absolute. Firstly, in the nature of their actions, Adam's trespass was self-serving, while Jesus' gift was self-sacrifice. And Jesus' work is superior to Adam's in its power and results. In verses 15 and 17, notice the repeated phrase, how much more, describing how Jesus' gift is superior to Adam's sin. Just imagine right now that someone is locked up, they're in chains, they're a slave, or a modern example, someone's facing deportation, they've been ripped away from loved ones, they're in a hopeless predicament. But just then imagine that a representative came in and used their power to gift them with freedom. Imagine the moment of joy, the relief, the hope when the shackles are released and they're set free again. You would just have to dance. Well, in verse 17, we have this image of bondage and chains as death reigned. Adam's sin did massive damage to us, and Jesus' representation wonderfully and graciously undoes, covers over all Adam's damage and gives us freedom. But Jesus goes further. Grace has two parts. Not only is someone's chains set free, verse 17 describes them also being elevated to royalty. Now represented by King Jesus, we reign in life. We are crowned, given royal clothes. We're given all the wealth and status of the king. Friends, grace goes so much further than not being punished as we deserved, but a whole nother step of overflowing and abounding in what we don't deserve. Christ is stronger, more powerful to save than Adam was to destroy. Look to verse 20. Where sin increased, grace increased all the more. Friends, whatever your sin, whatever those things in your life that bring you most shame, there is more grace in Jesus than sin in me. There's more grace in Jesus than sin in you. If you've seen the TV series Outlander, just want to say some scenes need to be fast forwarded. It's set in Scotland in 1945 in World War II, where a military doctor named Claire Randall discovers how to be transported back in time to the year 1743. And going back in time, she falls in love with this Highlander, Jamie Fraser. But as Claire is transported from one reality and humanity to another one, it raises many questions of her identity. Who is she? Friends, with this in mind, I can't overstate how epic and significant how justification switches our representation from Adam to Jesus. In Jesus, God has transferred us to a completely new reality, where we are now citizens, part of a new humanity. This is epic. This is remarkable. What Jesus has achieved 2,000 years ago changes everything today. But the problem is that so easily we forget our new identity. As I spoke about going from being slaves to reigning in life and now being clothed in Jesus' royalty, this may feel ridiculous to you because every day we still face daily struggles. We face the depth of our sin. It can be hard to confidently believe that Jesus' gift is more powerful than in Adam and that we're justified by grace alone, because sometimes grace feels weaker than sin. It often doesn't feel like we're reigning, and we can forget our glorious new identity in Jesus and then live in our old reality in Adam like everybody else. In this world, we are constantly pulled towards living under our old identity. We're prone to self-justification through our own efforts, proving ourselves, comparing ourselves, despising those we perceive as less holy or as competent as us. But now, represented by Jesus, grace frees us from all of this. The problem is that our experience of Jesus' representation is now and not yet. While under Jesus, right now, God sees you as legally righteous and reigning with him, yet our sinful nature is something that the Holy Spirit will be working on till the day we meet Jesus face to face, when the glory that Tim spoke about last week will be experienced in full. There was a special wedding here yesterday, and afterwards, the bride may choose to change her last name. I remember when my wife Adele changed her name after our wedding, mail would still come with her old name on it. Some forms of her ID, like her driver's license, took a while to switch over. Likewise, our identity has now switched to be exclusively represented by Jesus. Yet, like a new bride changing her name, every day there's still evidence of our old identity and life around. Things like our character, our motivations, idols. There are still bits of being under Adam around that the Spirit is starting to work on. In Jesus, we're becoming who we are. Just consider how you now see and project yourself. When you meet some new people, who are you? See, often we tie our identity to our roles like our work or studies or our family or living in Diamond Creek or our footy team. But most fundamentally, you are a human under Adam. But if you have transferred to Jesus' humanity, this is now the deepest, most significant, most profound thing about who you are. That Jesus now represents you, and your reality is now grace. In Outlander, as Claire was living in the past reality of the 1700s, she makes a huge difference when she lived in this earlier reality while anticipating her true identity, something experienced in the future. Likewise, as people under Jesus' new humanity, as we encounter parts of our old identity in Adam yet to be transformed, let's keep in focus of who we now are, our true new identity that one day will be experienced in full. We need to encounter. We need to constantly come back to God's radical, wonderful, undeserving grace in Jesus and become secure in it. Grace that's not weak, but stronger to make us safe and powerful enough to change us. Under Jesus, grace is more wonderful and powerful than sin. Once we were slaves, and now we reign in life, clothed in Jesus' royalty. May this grace overflow and abound in us. Amen.
Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Just search for St. John's, Diamond Creek.